The Inertial Law of Property, Toward an Evolutionary Theory of Ownership. This presentation proposes a reformulation of property theory grounded in evolutionary economics and systems dynamics. While classical liberal theory, most notably Locke's labor-based justification of acquisition, has heavily influenced libertarian and anarcho-capitalist conceptions of ownership, these frameworks mistake provisional, productive control for perpetual, moral entitlements. By introducing the law of objective advantage and the inertial law of property transfer, this essay offers a formal alternative. A productivity-based allocation model governed by evolutionary selection pressures, not metaphysical axioms. Property, in this formulation, is not a moral claim, but a dynamic and contestable strategy aimed at maximizing long-run productivity under uncertainty. 1. Introduction. Contemporary libertarian thought draws heavily from John Locke's labor theory of acquisition, which asserts that labor invested in unowned land justifies exclusive ownership. This idea has since evolved into a broader claim that property rights, once initiated, are both perpetual and morally absolute, particularly among anarcho-capitalist thinkers. However, such theories often fail to distinguish between the and the metaphysical elevation of past labor into timeless entitlement. They also ignore a more fundamental question: what enforces a right, and why should it persist? This essay critiques Lockean property theory as an overextension of a local productivity heuristic and replaces it with a formal model grounded in evolutionary game theory and natural selection. Specifically, it introduces the law of objective advantage, the inertial law of property transfer, and the evolutionary law of property as a coherent system for understanding when property should be allocated, retained, or transferred. 2. Locke's partial insight and fundamental misstep. Locke's core insight, that labor can justify the initiation of property, has practical merit in systems that reward early productivity. The initial user often creates value, lowers the cost of enforcement, and signals a higher productive use of previously unclaimed resources. This creates a local equilibrium that benefits the system as a whole by reducing transaction costs and incentivizing improvements. However, Locke's framework falters when it elevates initial productivity into eternal dominion, failing to distinguish between the justification of acquisition, the legitimacy of long-term control or transfer. Labor does not sanctify land. Rather, it generates productive inertia, a resistance to displacement due to the owner's demonstrated capacity to use and defend the resource. But as environmental conditions shift, new claimants may arise with superior productive potential. A system that permanently enshrines first use or labor as a moral absolute blocks these reallocations, and by doing so, undermines overall productivity. Notably, Locke's labor theory of acquisition shares structural features with the labor theory of value, most famously promoted by Marx. Both theories presume labor imparts moral or intrinsic legitimacy, despite modern economic evidence that value is contextual and performance-based. Libertarian thinkers often reject Marx's theory while unknowingly relying on a similarly flawed metaphysics. 3. Three laws of evolutionary property. To replace this metaphysical foundation, we present a framework based on evolutionary principles, where property is justified and retained only insofar as it contributes to systemic productivity. 3.1 Law of Objective Advantage. A property claim is objectively justified when an agent's expected productivity with the resource exceeds that of any known alternative user, regardless of the perceptions or preferences of the incumbent. This law defines the optimal distribution of property from an evolutionary standpoint. The resource should be allocated to the agent with the greatest marginal productivity, even if the current holder subjectively believes otherwise. It is a formal restatement of comparative advantage, applied to dynamic property systems. 3.2 Inertial Law of Property Transfer. A transfer of property occurs when the net evolutionary gain from reallocation, defined as the challenger's expected productivity minus the incumbent's marginal loss, exceeds both the incumbent's productive inertia and the frictional cost of transfer. This law describes how property actually changes hands in evolutionary systems. Productive inertia functions analogously to mass in Newtonian physics. The challenger's force must exceed not only this inertia but also system friction, i.e., the transaction costs, institutional lag, and reputational barriers to transfer. Importantly, this updated formulation makes explicit that the incumbent's marginal productivity loss must be subtracted from the challenger's expected gain. A transfer that merely shifts productivity from one agent to another without a net system improvement is not justified. This prevents reallocations that create churn without evolutionary benefit. This model corrects the libertarian fallacy of static property rights by showing that retention of control is always provisional. Ownership persists only until a more productive use can afford to overcome both inertia and drag, and only when the systemic gain justifies the displacement cost. 3.3 Evolutionary Law of Property. Property exists as a strategy selected by evolution to maximize long-run productivity under uncertainty. A claim to ownership is valid only to the extent that it serves this adaptive function. This law grounds the entire framework. Property is not a moral axiom, it is a tool, an emergent institution favored by natural selection because it improves coordination, enables investment, and lowers conflict when used properly. When it no longer does these things, it is restructured or destroyed, just like any other maladaptive trait. 4. Natural enforcement and the myth of rights. Us right without enforcement is a rhetorical illusion. Libertarian theories of natural rights rarely ask the critical question, what enforces this right, and why would it persist across time? In evolutionary systems, the only persistent enforcer is natural selection. Rights are not respected because they are declared, they are respected because their enforcement improves the survival and productivity of the broader system. Libertarian appeals to consent, non-aggression, or contract assume a world where enforcement is costless, frictionless, and universal, conditions that have never existed. By contrast, the evolutionary model recognizes that force, inertia, and friction shape every real-world property transfer. And that reputation and productivity are the only currencies that matter in long-term systems optimization. 5. Implications and conclusion. By reinterpreting property through an evolutionary lens, we can discard the static metaphysics of Locke and Rothbard in favor of a dynamic model grounded in observable outcomes. The initial productivity of a claimant justifies acquisition, not perpetual dominion. Ownership is an evolving equilibrium, not an eternal moral truth. The libertarian position that our first use, or labor mixing, grants perpetual rights collapses under evolutionary scrutiny. Instead, property must be viewed as an allocation of capital toward the highest marginal use, a system which only functions if claims are contestable and transfers are permitted under conditions of superior productivity. This framework offers a principled and formal replacement for Lockean property theory. It aligns with both physics and economics. More importantly, it offers an adaptive and forward-compatible model of ownership, one designed not to preserve arbitrary claims, but to build the most productive system possible in the face of uncertainty.